The world ended and began again in the same moment for 5 boys from rural Kentucky. They came from tobacco farms that had been in their families for generations, from hollows where the Appalachian Mountains pressed down with the weight of centuries, from a world where poverty wasn't shameful, but simply the condition of existence. Their names were Henry Garrett, age 19, the oldest of 7 children whose mother had died when Henry was barely old enough to remember her face. There was Samuel Buchanan, 18 years old, whose father had broken his back in a mining accident and whose family worked their small patch of land with the kind of desperation that turned boys into men before their time. James Whitney, 17, the brightest of the 5, had read every book the county library possessed, dreaming of a world beyond the mountains that seemed to hold his family prisoner. William Klaus, just turned 19, worked 2 jobs before enlisting, one on a neighboring farm and one in the coal mines that scar the landscape like wounds that would never heal. And finally, there was Thomas Keller, the youngest at 16 when he lied about his age to join his friends. A boy so thin his uniform hung on him like a scarecrow's clothes, but whose determination burned with the intensity of someone who believed military service was his only escape from a life of predetermined failure. In the spring of 1945, these 5 friends enlisted together, swearing they would stay together through whatever came next. They arrived at a training facility in Indiana with dirt still under their fingernails and an innocence that struck the drill sergeants as almost comical. The sergeant who met them, a man named Kovac with a face like granite and eyes that had seen things he never spoke about, looked at the 5 of them standing in a line and shook his head slowly. "Where did you boys come from?" Henry stepped forward slightly. "Kentucky, sir. Mountains." Kovac nodded like this explained everything about their physical weakness and their evident lack of understanding about how the military worked. "Mountains. Well, the mountains won't help you here. Nothing but hard work and discipline will do that." But the 5 boys learned faster than anyone expected. The rural poverty that had defined their lives had taught them something valuable about enduring discomfort. They were used to going without. They understood sacrifice because their families had practiced it every single day. Other recruits complained about the food and the hours and the brutality of the training. Henry, Samuel, James, William, and Thomas simply accepted these things as part of a larger transition from one kind of hardship to another, different kind of hardship. They trained together, fought together in their small unit. And when the war in Europe began to collapse in early 1945, they were assigned together to a military facility in southern Germany, part of the occupation forces that would secure the territory and manage the transition from war to whatever came next. The unit moved through the German countryside in late April, encountering burned-out villages, abandoned fortifications, and the visible scars of a nation that had spent 6 years conducting total war. What they did not expect to encounter was a convoy of trucks, heavily damaged and nearly out of fuel, carrying 93 German women in circumstances that made Henry Garrett's heart constrict in his chest in a way he didn't understand. The trucks had broken down on a road that ran through a valley surrounded by forests that were beginning to show the first signs of spring. The German women had been transported without adequate water or food, crowded into vehicles that should have held perhaps 50 people with comfort, but instead held nearly 100. They came from a variety of backgrounds, captured during the final push into Germany, gathered from hospitals and administrative offices and civilian populations that had been swept up by the advancing American forces. The truck drivers, exhausted from days of driving and managing the logistical nightmare of moving so many prisoners, had radioed for assistance and received word that a nearby military unit would arrive within hours to provide support. That unit was Henry's. The 5 boys from Kentucky, now soldiers in the American Army, pulled up to the scene in a supply truck and found themselves face to face with a humanitarian crisis that nobody had briefed them on and for which their training had provided absolutely no preparation. The German women were visible through the truck slats, faces pressed against the wooden gaps, eyes that showed a combination of fear and desperation, and a weariness that came from days of suffering in conditions that would have been illegal anywhere except in the chaos of a collapsing military campaign. Henry Garrett felt something shift inside him, a recognition that these weren't enemies in the abstract sense that propaganda had trained him to think about. They were people, actual human beings in immediate need of help. He approached the ranking officer present, a lieutenant named Foster, who seemed to be overwhelmed by the situation and almost grateful for the arrival of additional soldiers. "Sir, those women need water and medical attention," Henry said without waiting for permission to speak, a breach of military protocol that Foster seemed too exhausted to address. They've been in those trucks for 2 days with minimal supplies. Several of them are showing signs of heat exhaustion. The lieutenant looked at him with an expression that mixed surprise and something that might have been respect. "What's your name, soldier?" "Henry Garrett, sir. Kentucky." "Well, Garrett, you're right. They need water and medical supplies and somewhere to rest. But I don't have authorization to provide those things. These are prisoners of war, and my orders are transport them to a processing facility." Henry understood the impossible position Foster was in, caught between regulations and the visible evidence of human suffering. "Sir, with respect, they won't survive the journey if we don't provide basic care. The trucks need repairs, fuel, and time. While we address those issues, couldn't we provide humanitarian assistance that wouldn't violate any orders?" Foster looked at the trucks, at the visible conditions inside them, and made a decision that would echo through the lives of everyone involved. "Do what you can, Garrett. Nothing that violates direct orders, but basic humanitarian care is acceptable under the Geneva Convention. Help the women. Get water distributed. See if the medical supplies we carry can be made available. I'll handle the paperwork." What happened next happened with a speed that suggested everyone had been waiting for permission to act on what their basic human decency demanded. Samuel Buchanan and James Whitney broke open the medical supplies, while William Klaus and Thomas Keller began distributing water to the German women. The truck doors were opened, and the women began to emerge, blinking in the sunlight, moving with the stiffness that came from hours of confinement in inadequate space. Henry worked alongside them, helping women down from the trucks, speaking no German, but understanding from their body language what they needed and what they feared. A woman near the door staggered, and Henry caught her before she fell. "Water," he said, producing a canteen. "You need water." The woman, who was perhaps 30 years old with dark hair pinned back in a style that had been maintained even through capture and transportation, looked at him with an expression of confusion, as if kindness from an American soldier was a concept her mind couldn't quite process. Henry held out the canteen, and she took it with a trembling hand, drank deeply, then handed it back with the kind of gratitude that made Henry understand something fundamental about the human condition. People who had been treated cruelly were shocked and almost devastated by basic decency. Over the course of that afternoon and evening, the 5 friends from Kentucky performed what amounted to a rescue operation without ever using that word or thinking of themselves as heroes. They distributed food from their own rations. They used medical supplies to treat the most obvious injuries and illnesses. They found blankets and created a makeshift camp in a nearby clearing where the women could rest in conditions that were far from ideal, but infinitely better than the trucks had provided. James Whitney, whose education and verbal abilities outpaced his friends, attempted to communicate with the German women, using fragments of German he'd learned from books and managing to convey basic information and reassurance. The woman whose arm Henry had caught and steadied, whose name was Margarethe Stein, began to serve as a translator between the American soldiers and the other prisoners, and through her, Henry learned something about where these women had come from and what they had endured. Margarethe had been a nurse in Berlin until the bombing of the city had destroyed the hospital where she worked. She had been conscripted into auxiliary military service, not as a combatant, but as administrative and medical personnel, and had been captured during the final American push into Germany. The other women had similar stories, a collection of individuals who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, whose capture was almost incidental to their actual lives and identities. Many were nurses. Some were clerical workers. Others were civilians who had simply been in occupied territory when the Americans arrived. They were not soldiers in any meaningful sense, and many of them had been terrified of their American captors, fully believing the Nazi propaganda that American soldiers committed atrocities against prisoners. The night that the 5 boys from Kentucky spent with the 93 German women became something none of them would ever fully process or explain to people who hadn't been there. They shared their rations equally, ensuring that the women received the same food and water as the soldiers. They kept watch through the night, not because escape was a realistic possibility, but because the women felt safer knowing that armed men were present to protect them from whatever dangers might lurk in the darkness. Henry spent much of the night talking with Margarethe, learning about her life before the war, about the family she hoped to find when she was eventually repatriated, about her fear that everything she had known had been destroyed in the bombing and chaos of the final months of the war. By morning, something had fundamentally changed in how the American soldiers and the German prisoners perceived each other. The trucks were repaired by the next afternoon, and Lieutenant Foster made a decision that showed either remarkable courage or a willingness to bend regulations in ways that would never be officially documented. He divided the 93 prisoners, keeping only 67 with the unit that would continue to a designated POW facility, and arranging for the remaining 26 to be processed through a different route. This decision was made with the understanding that the 67 women would receive care and treatment from 5 soldiers who had proven their commitment to treating prisoners as human beings. The 5 boys from Kentucky became the primary overseers of the 67 women, and they took this responsibility with a seriousness that bordered on obsession. They arranged for the women to have adequate shelter in a requisitioned German military compound that had not been damaged in the fighting. They coordinated with the military medical personnel to provide health care. They used their off hours to create something approaching a normal environment within the confines of the compound. Samuel Buchanan, who had worked as a cook before enlisting, took over much of the meal preparation, using whatever ingredients could be obtained to create food that was not just adequate, but that showed care and attention. William Klaus began teaching basic English to some of the younger women, understanding that language would be crucial to their survival and future. James Whitney, with his love of books and learning, established a makeshift library where the German women could read in their own language and begin learning English from written materials. Thomas Keller, the youngest of the 5, formed a particular connection with the children of the compound, of which there were 6, small children born to German women during the war years, whose fathers were missing or dead or somewhere else in the machinery of war. Thomas spent hours playing with these children, improvising toys from scraps of materials, creating a sense of normalcy in an abnormal situation. And Henry Garrett became the de facto leader of the 5, the one who interfaced with military command, the one who advocated for the women's needs, the one who made sure that the 5 soldiers did not become so absorbed in caring for the prisoners that they neglected their official military duties. The relationship between the 5 soldiers and the 67 women developed in ways that would have seemed impossible to predict. The women began to teach the American soldiers German words and songs. The soldiers brought small gifts that they obtained through various means, sometimes legitimate, and sometimes through exchanges that would not have withstood close official scrutiny. A soldier might trade cigarettes for services that the German women could provide, like mending uniforms or creating craft items. The women began to trust the 5 soldiers in ways they didn't extend to other American personnel, understanding that these particular men had chosen to treat them with dignity and respect that went far beyond what regulations demanded. By summer of 1945, word of the 5 soldiers and their effective management of the 67 women prisoners had reached higher levels of military command. An inspector arrived, a major named Richardson who had the bearing of someone who expected to find violations and was prepared to address them severely. Richardson spent 3 days observing the compound, watching how the 5 soldiers interacted with the prisoners, reviewing documentation and conditions. His conclusion was delivered to Henry in the commander's office, where Henry stood at attention, fully expecting criticism. The major looked up from his papers, and his expression was unreadable. "You 5 have created the most successful prisoner management operation I've observed in 3 years of inspection tours," he said without preamble. "Your women show no signs of unrest or dissatisfaction. They're cooperative, healthy, productive. The compound is well maintained. Morale is high among both prisoners and guards. How did you manage this?" Henry hesitated, choosing his words carefully. We treated them like people, sir. They're not soldiers. They're women who were caught up in a war they didn't create. We provided them with conditions that acknowledged their humanity, and they responded to that treatment by becoming cooperative and productive. Major Richardson nodded slowly, and something in his expression suggested that he understood exactly what Henry meant and approved of it, even if official military culture would never acknowledge such an approach. Carry on, Garrett. Whatever you're doing is working. I'm going to recommend that your unit be allowed to continue the program without increased oversight. By fall of 1945, as the war in Europe had now been over for months and the post-war structure of occupation and prisoner management was being formalized, the 5 soldiers from Kentucky had become embedded in the lives of the 67 women in ways that neither military regulations nor rational military command structures could have anticipated. Romantic attachments began to form with an inevitability that suggested human nature simply did not care about regulations regarding fraternization between soldiers and prisoners. Henry found himself drawn to Margarethe Stein, the nurse who had served as translator and who had become indispensable to the smooth functioning of the compound. William Klaus fell in love with a woman named Stephanie Bauer, a former clerical worker from Munich who had a quick wit and a capacity for laughter that made her invaluable to maintaining morale among the other prisoners. Samuel Buchanan and a woman named Anna Hoffman, who had worked in the kitchen of a hospital before her capture, began a romance that was conducted with complete transparency, as if they were testing whether openness might make the relationship acceptable to military command. James Whitney found himself increasingly drawn to Liesl Kaufman, a young woman of barely 20 who had been conscripted into administrative service and who, when she wasn't performing her duties in the compound office, spent considerable time with James discussing literature and philosophy and the kinds of intellectual pursuits that made both of them feel less like prisoners and guards and more like 2 people who had found each other during impossible circumstances. Thomas Keller, the youngest of the soldiers, developed what could only be described as a protective relationship with several of the older women who reminded him of his own mother, who he had lost in childhood. The 5 soldiers began to understand, gradually and then with sudden clarity, that they did not want to return to Kentucky to lives of grinding rural poverty. They understood that the women they had come to care for, and in some cases love, would need to remain prisoners until repatriation could be arranged, and that repatriation meant separation, possibly permanent separation, unless they could navigate a bureaucratic system that had not been designed to accommodate marriage between American soldiers and German prisoners. Henry made the decision to request a permanent reassignment that would keep him at the compound. His request was approved with the understanding that his role would shift from that of guard to something more like administrator of the women's compound, a position that had been formalized as the occupation settled into its routine operations. The other 4 soldiers followed similar paths, arranging for extended assignments that would keep them at the compound while the machinery of post-war negotiations and peace treaties proceeded at its glacial pace. By early 1946, Henry understood that the time had come to formalize what had already become emotionally official. He approached Margarethe one evening in the compound courtyard and told her that he wanted to marry her, that he was willing to navigate whatever bureaucratic obstacles existed to make that happen. Margarethe, who had spent months expecting separation and loss, looked at him with an expression that combined disbelief and hope in equal measure. You would do this? Even though I am German? Even though the war only ended months ago? Even though people will call you a traitor for loving an enemy? Henry took her hands and said words that would have been remarkable in their simplicity if they were not also profound in their implications. I don't care what people will say. I know you. I know who you are. The war didn't define you, and it doesn't define me. And I'm not going to let bureaucracy or national identity or any of the other things that people use to divide themselves from each other define what we have found with each other. By the spring of 1946, formal requests for marriage had been submitted by the 5 soldiers from Kentucky: Henry and Margarethe, William and Stephanie, Samuel and Anna, James and Liesl. Thomas, the youngest, requested a transfer to remain close to the compound while he processed a different kind of love, one that was protective and familial, and that would eventually lead him to sponsor the immigration of 3 of the older women from the compound who had no family to return in Germany. The requests were processed through the same machinery that had reviewed the Camp Swift marriage proposals, moving through military bureaucracy and eventually reaching the State Department and the War Department. The investigations were thorough and sometimes invasive. Officials wanted to understand whether the relationships were genuine or whether they represented some kind of German conspiracy to infiltrate American society through marriage. They wanted to verify that no information had been compromised, that no security breaches had occurred. They wanted to ensure that the marriages would not be seen as betrayals of American interests or as insults to American soldiers who had actually fought and died in combat against German forces. Through it all, the 5 soldiers and the 67 women waited. Some of the other women in the compound began to date American soldiers, and by the end of 1946, 18 additional marriage requests had been filed by soldiers working in various capacities of the compound. The 5 original soldiers became mentors to these other men, showing them how to navigate the system, how to document their relationships, how to approach military command with requests that might otherwise have been immediately denied. Henry became something like an unofficial advocate for all of the couples, understanding that his early success with Margarethe had created a precedent that made it easier for subsequent couples to be taken seriously. The first of the 5 soldiers to complete the marriage process was Henry and Margarethe. Their wedding took place in December of 1946, conducted in a simple ceremony at a chapel on the military base, attended by the other soldiers, by as many of the 67 women as could be given permission to attend, and by several officers who came to observe what had become a matter of some military and political significance. Henry wore his dress uniform. Margarethe wore a dress that had been made from white fabric that had been obtained through connections and favors and the kind of creative problem-solving that soldiers were expert at. When they exchanged vows, the entire chapel fell silent, understanding that this moment represented something larger than the union of 2 individuals. It represented the possibility that even profound conflict could be overcome, that even during a time when nations were destroying each other, personal connections could bridge seemingly unbridgeable divides. William and Stephanie were married in January of 1947. Samuel and Anna were married in March of 1947. James and Liesel were married in May of 1947. Thomas, rather than marrying one of the women from the compound, completed the sponsorship process that would allow 3 women who had lost their entire families to immigrate to the United States as residents. And he spent the years following the war helping them establish themselves in a small town in Ohio, where he had found work at an electronics factory. By the end of 1947, all 4 of the soldiers who had romantic partners from the compound had been formally married, and all 4 couples had begun the process of creating civilian lives together outside of the military system. Henry and Margarethe purchased a small farm in Kentucky, returning to the mountains where Henry had grown up. Margarethe learned English fluently, though she never lost her accent, and she became a nurse in the rural county hospital, bringing medical skills and compassion to a community that desperately needed both. She gave birth to 2 children, a boy and a girl, who grew up bilingual and bicultural, comfortable in both American and German traditions. Henry worked the farm and took side jobs in construction, building a life that was far more secure and prosperous than anything he might have achieved if the war had not intervened. When asked about his experience during the war and the post-war period, Henry always said the same thing. I went to war as a boy from a poor family with no prospects and no hope. I came home with a wife and a purpose and an understanding that people are more than the nations they come from. William and Stephanie settled in Ohio, where William found work in the automobile manufacturing industry. Stephanie's organizational skills translated into a career in business administration, and she eventually became one of the first women to hold a significant management position in her company. They had 3 children together and remained married for 63 years until William's death in 2010. At his funeral, Stephanie spoke about how the war, despite its horror and devastation, had been the vehicle for their meeting, and that she had spent every day of their marriage grateful for the circumstances that had brought a Kentucky boy and a Munich girl together in a German prisoner compound. Samuel and Anna opened a restaurant in Indianapolis, initially serving German cuisine, but gradually evolving into a family restaurant that became renowned in the city for its combination of Kentucky and German foods, a culinary representation of the merger of two cultures. Anna gave birth to 4 children, and the restaurant became a family business that passed to the next generation and created employment for dozens of people over the decades. Samuel died in 1995, and Anna continued to operate the restaurant until her retirement at age 84. She spent her final years writing a memoir of her experience as a prisoner of war and her transition to becoming a fully American citizen, a document that was eventually published and distributed to libraries and historical societies. James and Liesl moved to California, where James found work teaching at a community college and Liesl worked as a librarian. They had 2 children together and became fixtures in their community, known for their quiet intellectualism and their commitment to promoting cross-cultural understanding through education. James published several historical articles about the prisoner of war experience, and Liesl became a respected translator and interpreter for German-speaking immigrants. Both remained passionate about literature and philosophy throughout their lives, and their home became a gathering place for students and intellectuals who valued the conversations and connections they could make there. Thomas, working in Ohio as a sponsor for the 3 women who had no family to return to, eventually married one of them, a woman named Helga Fischer who had been in her 50s when she arrived at the compound. They never had biological children together, but they became the de facto guardians for the 2 other women he had sponsored, and their home became a refuge for German immigrants who needed assistance adjusting to American life. Thomas worked at the same electronics factory for 42 years and became known as someone who would go to extraordinary lengths to help people who were struggling or lost. The compound itself was eventually closed in 1948 as the post-war occupation transitioned into permanent military installations and formal repatriation procedures were completed. Of the 67 women who had arrived at the compound in the chaos of the war's final weeks, 43 chose to remain in the United States permanently. 24 returned to Germany to search for family members and attempt to rebuild their shattered lives in a nation that was itself rebuilding. Several of the women who returned to Germany eventually re-emigrated to the United States, finding that they had changed too much during their years in America to readjust to post-war German society. Some of these later immigrants were sponsored by the 5 soldiers, who remained committed to the welfare of the women and maintained contact with many of them for the rest of their lives. The 5 soldiers from Kentucky, who had arrived at the military facility as boys from an impoverished rural background with no prospects and no hope, became something different through their experience with the 67 German women. They became men who understood that compassion was compatible with strength, that treating people with dignity did not weaken authority, that the divisions between nations and enemies and us and them could be transcended through individual acts of kindness and courage. They became a testament to the power of ordinary people to change circumstances and create something meaningful from the rubble of conflict. Henry Garrett lived until 2003, and in his final years he was recognized by various historical organizations for his role in establishing one of the most successful prisoner of war management programs of the post-war period. Military historians who studied his methods found that the compound he and his friends had managed showed some of the lowest rates of prisoner unrest and some of the highest rates of successful post-war integration of any comparable facility. The secret, historians concluded, was the same secret that Lieutenant Brennan at Camp Swift had understood. Treating prisoners like human beings produced better results than treating them like enemies. The story of the 5 boys from Kentucky and the 67 German women prisoners became, like the Camp Swift story, a footnote in the larger historical narrative of World War II and its aftermath. It was overshadowed by the major battles and diplomatic negotiations that dominated historical accounts. But for the communities that these 5 soldiers eventually built, for the families that resulted from their unions with the women they loved, For the generations of children and grandchildren who inherited the hybrid cultures that resulted from marriages between Americans and Germans, the story was everything. It was the beginning of lives that would not have existed if these 5 boys from the mountains had allowed themselves to be trapped by the definitions that war imposed on them. It was proof that even in times of profound conflict and division, the human capacity for connection and compassion could create outcomes that transcended everything propaganda and nation-states and military organizations said was impossible. Years later, historians would note that the marriages that resulted from the prisoner work programs at Camp Swift and at the compound managed by the 5 Kentucky soldiers produced some of the most successful immigrant families in post-war American history. The children of these unions became doctors and teachers and business leaders and artists. They brought skills and perspectives and work ethics that enriched their communities. They served as living bridges between 2 nations that had been at war, proving through their very existence that enemies could become family, that national identity did not have to determine personal destiny, that treating people with dignity during conflict created the foundation for lasting peace. The 5 soldiers from Kentucky never returned to the lives of grinding poverty that had awaited them in their home communities. They had been changed by their experiences, elevated by their choices to treat prisoners as human beings, enriched by the love and partnerships that resulted from their compassion. They had discovered that the war, despite all of its horror and devastation, had also been an instrument of liberation, freeing them from the poverty and hopelessness that would have otherwise defined their lives. And they understood, with a clarity that they never attempted to express, but that shaped every decision they made in their post-war lives, that the greatest victory in any war was the victory of one person's humanity over another's hatred, one soldier's kindness over another's cruelty, one man's courage to love despite impossible circumstances over 1,000 voices telling him it was forbidden.